We desperately need to flip the conversation here. Putin is not stringing Trump along. Trump is stringing all of us along, and that's a problem. You can see everyone going down the wrong path in the media. Can Zelensky convince Trump that Putin is stringing him along? Putin made Trump wait, then strung him along. Putin is stringing Trump along, and Trump doesn't seem to realize it. It's all over the place. And it's not only the media and pundits that are responsible here. It is also a part of the discussion in Capitol Hill. We saw that recently in a congressional testimony from Marco Rubio that I will get to in a moment. Bottom line is that this is a common perception both on Capitol Hill and in the media, and it's no longer accurate. To be fair, it may have been accurate a couple of months ago, when Trump first started getting involved in trying to negotiate an end to the war. At that point, it was reasonable to think that perhaps Trump and Putin had some sort of weird connection and that Trump was being taken advantage of during that time. But literally months have passed now, and we need to move on to the realization that it is Trump stringing us along. And by us, I mean all of us. You, me, the media, especially the media, anyone following it in the United States, the world, and yes, ironically, Vladimir Putin too. And due to that irony, there are some minor benefits associated with Trump stringing Putin along. But in the grand scheme of things, those benefits are small compared to the lack of attention that's being paid in the West, both among the mass media and audiences, but again, crucially on Capitol Hill. The efforts that should be made to try to do something that could plausibly affect the war are not being done because of the focus on Trump being strung along by Putin, rather than, again, shifting the narrative that Putin is stringing us along. So let's get to it. To give you a rough analogy that I think is useful for the situation, the perception is that Trump and Putin are sitting at a poker table already, and Putin is just slowly playing things out, and Trump keeps calling, more or less. Whereas a more accurate metaphor here would be that the United States actually has all of the cards, but at the same time, the United States is refusing to sit down at a table because it is unwilling to pay the ante. And meanwhile, you have a whole bunch of other countries, namely in Europe, that are trying to convince the United States to sit down, but the United States is just not going to be sitting at any table, and those countries need to be thinking about some other plan given that that is the case. To put some structure on an otherwise unstructured conversation, I'm going to begin by discussing Trump's disposition when he entered office in January, just a few months ago, and why it was plausible at that time to think that Trump was not really sure what to make of the situation between the United States and Russia, never mind the situation between Russia and Ukraine. And that transitions us to the first period of negotiations over the first couple of months in office, where Trump was trying to feel out the situation, and at the time, it was reasonable to interpret that Putin was indeed stringing along Trump. Then we'll look deeper inside of the thought process that goes on inside of the Oval Office, which has become increasingly clear to those of us who have been following the internal debates, and why ultimately the United States did not have credibility in these negotiations to threaten Russia with things that Russia would actually care about in the event that the Kremlin did not buckle in the manner that Donald Trump wanted. What is interesting about this is that the Trump administration was well aware of its own lack of credibility at the time, but of course it's not the type of thing that it wants to shout out and broadcast to the rest of the world, which is why it is reasonable, again, to look at the first period of negotiations and think it was reasonable at the time to understand that Trump might be being strung along by Putin. But now, retrospectively, as it has become increasingly obvious to anyone who is focusing on what's coming out of the Oval Office now, this lack of U.S. credibility explains U.S. bargaining behavior in that first period of negotiations. So that's actually just a conversation about a cost-benefit analysis from the Trump administration's perspective, that it's thinking about how costly it would be to impose additional sanctions on the Kremlin, or alternatively, how costly it would be to arm Ukraine if Russia does not come to the bargaining table. And the calculation ultimately being made is that, well, it's not worth it. And given that, the United States can't leverage those threats against the Kremlin to try to force the Kremlin to come to the bargaining table. Then, once we're armed with the knowledge of what was going on in the Oval Office many months ago, we can talk about the most recent month or two, and the implausibility of Putin still stringing along Donald Trump, despite all of those narratives, both in the media and among other politicians, that this is the case. That it's just not plausible at this point to think that that is the case. And I'm going to be focusing on circumstantial evidence initially for that section, but then that takes us to the next point, which is, in fact, there is direct evidence that Trump is aware of this. We have a leak from the Oval Office about the internal conversations among Trump officials and Donald Trump himself that gives us direct evidence that Trump is fully aware that Putin is trying to string him along. Of course, you can't really be strung along if you are well aware that someone is stringing you along. So I want to talk about why we should flip the script here and think about how Donald Trump is stringing us along. Again, all of us in the United States, including US politicians, but also globally, in Europe, and in the Kremlin. And that will give us some sort of insight into what the benefits are from the Trump administration's perspective on this, but also some of the problems that come along with it. And that really hits the final point, which is that we're missing a debate here. That there are a whole bunch of political actors in the United States and in Europe that should be focusing on other things if they really wanted to do better for themselves, given what their goals are for this particular situation, which is, in fact, applying real coercive pressure to the Kremlin. If that's the goal, then really they should be dispatching of this whole notion that Trump is being strung along by Putin. They should be aware and cognizant and calling out how Trump is stringing all of us along, and then do something about that in relation to what sort of pressure could really be applied to the Kremlin. A useful starting point for this conversation is when Donald Trump took the oath of office for a second time in January of this year, and for us to think about what his general disposition was regarding the United States' position in international affairs, what the Biden administration left over for him, and what the intelligence community and what the recommendations were regarding all of that. If I had to use a single word to sum everything up with Trump's disposition, distrustful would be a good first stab at it. Take everything that the Biden administration had learned and done over the last 4 years, and then tried to pass along to the incoming Trump administration. Take that all and just throw it away. Whatever Trump wanted to know, he was going to find out for himself. He was not going to trust that the Biden administration had done it properly and was giving him good information. And that, crucially, included what was happening between Russia and Ukraine. Certainly, candidate Trump had made quite the bombastic claims regarding that conflict, that upon entering office, in 24 hours, he would be able to resolve it, because the Biden administration ostensibly had done such a horrible job at managing the conflict between Ukraine and Russia that there needed to be a fresh face there to figure things out, and Trump would be the one to do that. Now, I do not think that Trump actually thought that he could resolve the war in one day. I think it's more reasonable to believe that he may have thought that a change in administrations might have done something to affect the bargaining environment between Kyiv and Moscow, which may not be obvious to us and indeed may not have been obvious to him either, but the change may have done something, which then could have permitted a relatively smooth mediation process. So the conflict doesn't get resolved in literally 24 hours, but upon entering office and then pivoting to focusing on that conflict, that Trump mediating the process in 24 hours might have created the tunnel with a light at the end of it that the Trump administration could then guide Moscow and Kyiv down to resolve the conflict properly. No doubt that there would be plenty of reasons to be skeptical that that could actually happen. Everyone listening from the outside was well aware of this, and there are plenty of people inside of Trump's own administration that would have been pointing that out as well. But this was something that Trump was going to have to figure out for himself one way or another. The political narrative surrounding the situation was not something that Trump was inherently going to believe, and he wanted to be open to the possibility that something else was going to happen. Even, again, if from our perspectives, the likelihood of that was relatively low. Along with that, let's zoom into what the thought process was in the Kremlin and Western perceptions of that at the time. Again, clearly the ongoing belief among the vast majority of the Western audience was that the Kremlin was not particularly interested in a ceasefire back in January or February, And now, with 4 more months of retrospect, we can be even more confident that not only was that the case back then, but it remains the case today. We could have a separate conversation as to why that is the case, whether it's because Russia thinks that it has the initiative along the Eastern Front and that any sort of ceasefire would destroy that initiative, meaning that there would be a shift in the balance of military power in favor of Ukraine should there be a ceasefire. And so Russia, to prevent that from happening, just continues to fight and does not allow a ceasefire to come to pass. There's also a renewed possibility that the Kremlin's sense of what will happen on the battlefield does not match what the perception is in the West or within Kyiv. And so when you have that mismatch in expectations, it's really hard to get a settlement to be implemented. But regardless, the exact reason is irrelevant for the implementation of the strategy from Donald Trump that we're going to be focusing on here. And it also did not have an impact on the strategy that the Kremlin was trying to adopt. Specifically, there were 2 tasks at hand here. One was to continue the offensives in Ukraine for whatever reason, and 2 was to not unnecessarily provoke the United States. The idea behind keeping up the offensives is straightforward, so no need to go into that. Not provoking Trump, though, is a little bit more complicated and served 2 purposes. First, there was some risk that the Kremlin would inadvertently provoke Donald Trump and cause Donald Trump to do something that Trump himself would not naturally want to do on his own. In other words, Trump had this vision for how diplomacy was going to go between the 2 countries. And if the Kremlin deviated too far away from that, Trump might get angry and he might get frustrated and he might feel like the Kremlin isn't giving him the proper respect that he should receive as the president of the United States. And when Trump gets into that sort of situation, he might lash out at the individual who caused that. And in this case, that might mean lashing out at the Kremlin, which would in turn mean giving arms and aid and other sorts of benefits to Ukraine just to hurt the Kremlin, even though Trump did not want to do that. We'll talk more about that in a bit. I want to focus for now, though, on the possibility that Trump naturally did, in fact, have an interest in arming Ukraine and sanctioning the Kremlin if some deal could not be reached. After all, that was what was written into the peace proposal strategy that was handed to Trump way back in April of 2024. And in the meantime, Trump had since appointed its author, Keith Kellogg, as special envoy to Ukraine and Russia. Although, if you're really paying attention, Keith Kellogg is now just the special envoy to Ukraine, which previews how far south this is going to go. But the fact that Kellogg was appointed to that position at all is evidence that Trump cared about what the proposal said and may have been buying into it. You have to remember that people that hold these sorts of positions have agency. And if you're thinking about this from the leader's perspective, you want to appoint people to positions that are agreeing with your relative disposition on the situation. So if Kellogg is the type of person that thinks that punishing Russia in the event that Russia does not agree to a ceasefire, if Kellogg thinks that that's a good idea, if Trump wants to appoint Kellogg to that position, at some level, Trump has to think it's a good idea as well. Maybe he's not going to execute it ultimately, but he's not the type of person that thinks that it's completely crazy to do that. Otherwise, Kellogg never gets that role. It is also easy to forget that, well, once upon a time, 1, Zelensky looked like that. 2, Zelensky and Trump actually had a pretty good relationship and would joke around, even after the scandal broke that would lead to Trump's first impeachment. Hold that thought for later. But 3, and most importantly here, Trump was the first president to arm Ukraine with lethal aid. During the Obama administration, there was non-lethal aid given to Ukraine. But Trump was the first president to actually provide military aid to Ukraine intended to go shoot and kill Russians. All of that is to say that if we jumped in a time machine, went 6 months into the future, I missed what had happened, and you told me that, in fact, the United States was providing a whole bunch of arms to Ukraine because Russia was not playing ball with a ceasefire, it would be very easy to craft a narrative that explains why that is the case. The flip side was China. And yeah, just that one word is a good summary of it. China. If you go back to Trump's first term, the country had been the focal point of his foreign policy agenda, and that whole Indo-Pacific pivot that many in Washington had been talking about for years before then. If you fast forward to Trump's second term, you could see that the same sort of prioritization was there as well, as Trump was trying to nominate Elbridge Colby for Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. We've talked before about Colby, but to quickly refresh your memory, this is the guy who is laser-focused on China. He is prioritizing that Indo-Pacific pivot above everything else. And he is so focused on it that he has gotten into trouble with some of his Republican colleagues in the past for being relatively disinterested in other issue areas, Iran, for example. This was well known by everyone inside of the Washington foreign policy establishment. Colby was the lead author of the 2018 National Defense Strategy, and after his time in office, he had moved on and written a book on the subject. So everyone was well aware that China was Colby's focus. But there was a delay in his confirmation in part because of that solitary China focus, and instead, in the meantime, who acted as the Undersecretary for Defense for Policy was someone that also clued into what was going on perhaps with Trump's thinking. That was Alexander Velez Green. The reason that he was well known within Washington is that he had crafted a white paper that roughly echoed the same sort of sentiment that Colby had written in the 2018 National Defense Strategy, and then later his book, although that had updated the Indo-Pacific pivot problem, given that there was this ongoing war inside of Ukraine. Now, the position that these two held, Velez Green on the interim basis and now Colby today, Undersecretary for Policy, that is much more important and much higher in a hierarchy than, say, a special envoy to Ukraine or a special envoy to Ukraine and Russia. This is a much bigger position. It tends to be the position where you're crafting fundamental policy that's going to be the guiding force for the entire administration. What that means is that if you're thinking about this from the Kremlin's perspective, there is a bit of a disagreement in these appointments. What is described in Kellogg's peace plan runs contrary to what these two had in mind with their policies. So, if you had to guess what the Trump administration might be thinking here, it would be that the Trump administration wants to focus on China and probably does not have a credible threat, emphasis on probably here, probably does not have a credible threat to provide Ukraine with lots of expensive materiel that would be able to propel Ukraine and fight on the battlefield in a way that would force Russia to make more concessions. And then you could throw in things like lingering animosity or potential lingering animosity between Zelensky and Trump, dating back to the affair that led to Trump's first impeachment. So, all told, from the Kremlin's perspective here, your default expectation is that, yeah, the Trump administration is likely not going to follow through, but you do not know that for sure, and thus there is an incentive to try to extend this process as long as possible to delay Trump's final decision, just in case Trump is ultimately going to side with the Kellogg plan, as opposed to this hard Indo-Pacific pivot. In turn, there was a period of time where it was perfectly reasonable to write headlines like these, where Trump is being played and strung along by Putin. And likewise, there was a period of time when it made sense for senators to criticize that sort of thing. Certainly, I am responsible to some degree for this as well, because if you go back and look at the videos that I've published in the last 4 months, certainly earlier on in that process, I had a lot of discussion to that effect as well. But another thing that I have been talking about for a while, and has not penetrated as much this sort of mainstream conversation, is the credibility of aid. How much the United States and the Trump administration specifically is willing to aid Ukraine when push comes to shove, and Russia is no longer interested, and apparently no longer interested, in reaching a ceasefire. And to the extent that there has been discussion about the credibility of aid to Ukraine, what is still missing oftentimes from that is the larger picture with the Indo-Pacific pivot and the plans that are being made inside of the Department of Defense to that effect. Put differently, if we now know that Trump had no desire to ever arm Ukraine, and that was never going to be a credible threat, then retrospectively, looking back at the negotiations that took place from January to today, it's not really possible for Putin to string Trump along because there was nothing that Trump was ultimately going to do anyway. To string Trump along would be to delay Trump from doing something. If Trump is never going to do anything, then Trump can't be strung along. And if you think further about the timeline here, there's another reason why we probably should have moved on from these headlines a while ago. Believing that it's still the case, even today, that Putin is stringing along Trump is internally inconsistent with how either side of the aisle views Donald Trump himself. Because these headlines have persisted for so long, they have begun dominating the media conversation, and very obviously that has filtered into the Trump administration directly. It's no longer just whispers about this that may have been the case in January. It is something that people in Trump's direct orbit are frequently being asked. We move on to more headlines here. Marco Rubio comments on whether Russia is stringing us along in Ukraine negotiations. There you have Marco Rubio, who is both the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, and probably since the start of this video has gotten 10 more roles inside of the White House. He's being asked about this. He has Trump's ear. So clearly he is able to go to Trump with that sort of concern as a National Security Advisor. And if he can do even just an ounce of his job, he would be doing that. To be clear, this has been going on for a while now, but the most recent testimony this week from Marco Rubio in the Senate, he was grilled on this for a long period of time, and he is aware of what's going on and he's answering questions regarding it. So he knows that this is happening, and he's talking about the conversations that he's having with others about it as well. So there is definitely a meta-knowledge about not only that this is happening, but that this is being discussed outside of the White House. The White House is aware of all of this. And if you still weren't sure, we can hear it from the man himself. Trump accuses Putin of stringing him along. Putin tapping me along with Russia's strikes on Ukraine. Trump is well aware of this sort of accusation and is now leveling it directly at the Kremlin. If you will permit me now, I would like to have two separate conversations. One with those of you who are fans of Donald Trump, and one for those of you who are not fans of Donald Trump. Let's start with the fans. Those of you who are not fans, you can tune me out for a minute. If you're a fan of Donald Trump, you probably think he's a genius at some level. He started his career in the real estate business, made a name for himself in that business. He then became a reality television show star, had the #1 show on US television. And then after that, he created a political brand that no one thought would go anywhere, but ended up winning the presidency twice. If you had that opinion of him before, why would that opinion suddenly stop? That he's clever? That he's strategic? He understands when people are manipulating him? If you have that going into this, then you should continue to have that same sort of thought process and same sort of expectation about the stringing along, and should be skeptical that Putin could successfully string Trump along for a long period of time. Okay, now the other half of you, those of you who are not Donald Trump fans, if you're a fan of Trump, you can tune me out for a minute. If you're not a fan of Donald Trump, you probably think he is some sort of manipulative sociopath. His real estate business was a scam all along, and somehow he made it decades doing that. He then became a TV star, yes, but that career just exploited his previous reputation, which actually wasn't really substantive anyway. Then he moved on to his political career, but that was just yet another way that Donald Trump found to cheat the system. So he was manipulative during his real estate career, his television career, and his political career. But now suddenly he has become exceptionally naive and is Putin's mark. The only way to square that circle is to think that Donald Trump is in the pocket of Vladimir Putin, in which case he's really not being strung along so much that he is being politically manipulated by some sort of compromat, because he's an agent of Russia. All right, well, I know that's a popular thing to talk about on the internet, but we need to have two different points in response to that. One, that is not something that is seriously entertained by serious politicians inside of Europe. I don't know why this is such a popular thing to talk about on the internet when there aren't actual politicians that believe that to be the case. I suppose for that group, it's the type of thing that's funny to think about, but at the same time, it's not a particularly productive thing in terms of figuring out actionable advice that may have positive effects for the world. Trump is often loathed by European officials for many reasons, and there's a lot of frustration inside of Europe with the various things that Donald Trump has done. But in terms of a serious conversation about Europeans thinking, I'm talking about European politicians, people in a position of power, thinking that Donald Trump is politically compromised by Russia, that's a non-starter for them. That's not what they think. Criticizing Trump for all sorts of policies, well, that's a good political idea for those European leaders as well as Canadian leaders, because it's the type of thing that is politically popular. So we certainly see a lot of that, but what we don't see is any real concern that Donald Trump is in the pocket of Vladimir Putin. Donald Trump just doesn't care, and that's what's driving his behavior. The other half of it is that if Donald Trump truly is an agent of Russia, man, is he horrible at his job. Think about everything that's going on between Europe and Russia, and separately the United States and Ukraine. Let's start with US-Ukraine relations. It is true that over the long run, we're almost certainly going to see a decline in the amount of aid that the United States gives to Ukraine. That is almost certainly true in the long run, especially as compared to what would have been the case with the Harris administration. But it's not all going away. You're seeing things like that mineral deal that was signed between the United States and Ukraine, and you're also seeing in the short and medium run still lots of shipments going to Ukraine. If Putin had Trump truly under his thumb due to some sort of blackmail that was available, then the United States would have cut those things off a long time ago. He would not be, for example, Trump would not be giving the okay for countries like Australia to ship some US weapons that Australia owns over to Ukraine. That is something that Trump could just veto, and he's not doing that. Meanwhile, going over to Europe and Russia, think about what Donald Trump has done for European defense expenditures. Not for what you might think of as the right reasons necessarily, but Donald Trump has inspired Europe, again, maybe not for the right reasons, to start spending lots of money on their defense. And while I have had many questions about the long-run follow-through on that, I think everyone shares an expectation now that what European defense spending is going to be looking like in the near future, and in the medium future, and also in the long-term future, all of that is going to be much higher than what our expectation was maybe just 6 months ago. And that is a big problem for Russia. There was a long period of time where Europe was not living up to its own defense commitments and guidelines. Go back to the 2014 annexation of Crimea, as well as the start of that shadow war in the Donbass. The response that Europe had to those actions was the 2% guideline under NATO, 2% of GDP spent on defense. Think about how long it took for some countries to reach that threshold. Think about how many countries never reached that threshold. Think about how many countries actually reached 2%, but only because Russia escalated into a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. That was the Europe that Putin was facing, a relative pushover and something that would be exactly what the Kremlin would want. But there is one man who changed it, and maybe it's not for the right reason, but because of Donald Trump, European defense spending is projected to increase rapidly. And that is something that is deeply concerning to the Kremlin, and definitely not the type of thing that the Kremlin would want Donald Trump to do if Donald Trump were being effectively blackmailed by the Kremlin. And one last point here. Donald Trump is among the least discreet human beings in the United States. If the Kremlin were somehow blackmailing Donald Trump, one of the first things that they would tell him to do is to really tone it down, and don't make yourself so obvious. The way that Donald Trump behaves, if he truly were an agent of Russia, would be roughly equivalent to someone in the 1960s going out onto the Washington Mall and saying, "I love communism, the Kremlin is great, why can't we be more like the Soviet Union?" That is not the type of thing that you would want your agent to be doing. That was all speculation, but fortunately we don't really need to speculate. We have some direct evidence coming from the White House. It turns out that people in the White House really want to leak things to the Wall Street Journal, and we have a couple of articles to that effect. The first one is titled, "Trump Promised to End 2 Wars Quickly. In private, he admits he's frustrated." Here's the relevant quote. "In recent weeks, Trump has privately griped to advisors that Putin doesn't want to end the war, and that both sides refuse to compromise. Trump has also asked advisors if they believe Putin has changed since Trump's last time in office, and expressed surprise at some of Putin's military moves, including bombing areas with children, according to people familiar with the remarks. This is not the type of reflection of someone who is being strung along. This is someone who is aware of what is going on, but also simultaneously realizing the limits of his coercive capacity because, well, he doesn't have a credible threat to implement any of the sanctions or punishment if Vladimir Putin and Russia do not follow through on ceasefire plans." Here is another one hot off the presses. European officials say Trump tells their leaders Putin isn't ready to end the war. Here's the relevant quote. "On a call Monday, President Trump told European leaders that Russian President Vladimir Putin isn't ready to end the war in Ukraine because he thinks he is winning, according to 4 senior European officials familiar with the conversation. This was in reaction to Trump's conversation one-on-one with Vladimir Putin that you'll remember happened earlier in the week. Again, that is an awareness of the situation and a communication to allies that this is what the Trump administration believes, which then may help the allies better craft policy in response to what the Kremlin has planned. Meanwhile, that second excerpt speaks to the possibility that Trump is a Russian agent. Quote, "The European officials said the call clarified for them that it would now be largely up to European countries to support Ukraine. Europeans don't believe the Trump administration will stop U.S. weapons exports as long as Europe or Ukraine pays for them," they said. Once more, that's not the type of thing that if Donald Trump were an agent of Russia, that Donald Trump would allow. But here we have European officials believing that is going to be the case because the European officials don't actually think that Donald Trump has been compromised by Russia. Of course, this process has been long and drawn out, and if it's not the case that this long time horizon has occurred because Donald Trump is being strung along by Vladimir Putin, then what the heck is going on? And the answer is what we previewed at the beginning of this. We talked about how Donald Trump is stringing all of us along. There are various different incentives that Donald Trump has to keep this process ongoing, even if it's not going to have any real fruit to it. If we're not actually going to have a serious ceasefire that is going to result in perhaps a long-run settlement between Ukraine and Russia. As a starting point, you could think that Donald Trump expects to suffer some type of domestic punishment if he is unable to live up to his campaign promise to get Russia and Ukraine to agree to some type of deal. Whether it is in 24 hours or 24 days or 240 days, certainly 240 days is worse than 24 hours. But the serious punishment comes perhaps when he has to throw his hands up into the air and give up. And so by continuing this process as long as he can, he is stringing those people along to try to reduce the amount of punishment or at least delay when that punishment actually will be implemented against him. Another problem here is that if a deal becomes infeasible between Russia and Ukraine, what's supposed to happen next is not the United States just walking away. The United States is supposed to do something. Threats have been made to punish Russia if that happens, in the form of perhaps economic sanctions levied directly against Moscow and military aid to Ukraine. But everything that we have talked about today, everything that we have seen so far, suggests that Donald Trump doesn't actually want to do that. And if Trump doesn't want to follow through on that threat, that's not going to look good to a whole bunch of people inside of the United States, including some people inside of his own party. Think about guys like Ben Shapiro or Senator John Kennedy. They want those punishments to be levied against the Kremlin. And if Donald Trump doesn't do that, he has to answer for that. Well, one way you can stall that sort of concern is by just not getting to the point where Russia and Ukraine are unable to reach an agreement. In other words, if you string along the peace process, which is apparently what is happening right now. Now, there is some upshot for Ukraine if Donald Trump is stringing along Vladimir Putin, albeit it's going to be a very small upshot. Vladimir Putin, I think the best way to describe it, has been, as of late, genuflecting toward peace. What I mean by that is that there's not a serious attempt at it, but he's having to do the very smallest token types of genuflections in the direction of peace in order to keep this charade going. And we have seen that with the couple of ceasefires that have been implemented with air quotes around it, because the ceasefire has a huge asterisk next to it, which is that those ceasefires weren't really ceasefires in the way that they were supposed to be. But I use that word genuflection from before because Putin has genuflected in the direction of a ceasefire, in that, yes, there were still ongoing battles, but there were some reports of some small changes to what was going on the front that provided the tiniest bit of relief to Ukraine. So I'm not saying that this is a net positive for Ukraine, because it's not, and we'll get to a whole bunch of problems in a moment, but the charade that has been played for the last few months has had at least some small minor upshot to it. Now, you might be asking yourself, why does Putin even bother with that small genuflection? And the answer is that there's a second pathway toward punishments toward Russia or assistance toward Ukraine, which is if Donald Trump is personally and publicly insulted by the Kremlin. I told you we would get back to this point, and now here we finally are. One way that Donald Trump might feel personally insulted is if Vladimir Putin is rejecting his ceasefire proposals, despite the fact that this has been a major focal point of foreign policy in the public sphere over the last few months. He doesn't want to be in a situation where Donald Trump is preoccupied by China, but he keeps poking and prodding Donald Trump enough that Trump just gets so frustrated he says, "Forget about China for a while, I'm going to really punish you inside of Ukraine." As a result, I could see this process continuing for a long period of time, even after the media narrative has shifted away from Vladimir Putin stringing along Donald Trump, and Donald Trump now being the one that is stringing us all along. The reason is that, again, Donald Trump is not the type of person that Vladimir Putin wants to pick a personal fight with, because that could influence what Donald Trump wants to do in terms of punishment. This is not a good thing for the Western coalition, though, and I think that deserves a larger conversation, which will be the last thing that we talk about today. I think we could center this conversation about what is upcoming at the end of June. There's going to be another NATO summit, not at the Brussels headquarters that you see here, but rather at The Hague in the Netherlands. This is going to be the annual summit among all heads of state inside of NATO. That is a prime opportunity for the heads of state, the various countries inside of NATO, to coordinate policy about what's going to be happening with Russia and what kind of support is going to be offered to Ukraine. It will also be prime time for some lines on pants, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. For the past couple of months, European leaders have exerted all sorts of effort, and now in retrospect, wasted all sorts of time, trying to convince the United States that Russia is the impediment to peace. Because the theory went that once Donald Trump realizes this is the case, then the United States will start funneling copious amounts of aid to Ukraine, and that will really help out that effort. Well, if that was never going to be the case because the United States never planned to follow through, then all of that time again by European leaders was wasted when they could have spent that time trying to think through other sorts of solutions that might actually be practical and that there would be follow-through on. So a really bad outcome for the West here would be to run in circles for another month and spoil that opportunity at the upcoming NATO summit, having all of the time being spent trying to convince Trump, rather than coming up with common sense solutions given the problems that are going on with the United States wanting to follow through on those threats. Let me give you a list of things that the West could have been talking about over the last few months that would have been more productive than the spinning of wheels that we have been doing instead. How much have you heard about the sanctions bill that is currently going through Congress? That's the type of bill that might force Donald Trump to follow through on punishments that Trump naturally by himself would be unwilling to. Maybe you've heard a little bit about it, but the amount of news attention and media attention to it has been relatively low. What about the possibility of placing a new price cap on Russian oil? Following Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, you'll remember that oil prices have plummeted, to the extent that the price cap that Western countries had previously set on Russian oil does not really have the same bite that it had before. There could be a serious conversation and a push afterward to lower that cap even further so that there is bite and that the Russian war machine's primary source of income will be further hit. It is also worth noting that the G7 summit is 1 week before the NATO summit, and if there is going to be a change to the price cap, it would occur at the G7 summit, which means now is the time to have the conversation about whether to do it. Or what about the frozen Russian assets that are currently controlled by Western countries? That is a large pool of money that could be used to purchase weapons, and then have those weapons be sent to Ukraine. So even if the United States is uninterested in naturally following through on the threat to punish Russia, you don't have to make it so it's costly and expensive for the United States to follow through. You could use the money from those frozen accounts to pay the United States to send those weapons over there. That's the type of creative solution which may ultimately not work out because it might not be a good idea, but if you have a conversation about it, you're doing something potentially productive. Or, to focus on the bigger picture, maybe make a persuasive argument to the Trump administration. That's not going to be about Trump being strung along, because that's not what's happening here. So making any appeal to the Trump administration that the Trump administration needs to wise up to it isn't going to work out. Instead, why not make the persuasive argument about the development of the Western liberal order, and why having a strong, successful European continent that is not under the threat of invasion from Russia is ultimately in the United States' best interest, not just because the United States is doing something quote-unquote good for the world, but in the United States' own long-run economic interest. And maybe we are getting there, given Trump's recent comments to the European leaders that he doesn't think that Russia is serious about the peace plan. But once more, what would be really bad for the Western coalition is for those wheels to be spinning for another full month and for this golden opportunity at the upcoming NATO conference to be completely squandered as a result. Maybe I should go there and check for myself. In the meantime, you can check out this video about that Western world order that I talked about just a moment ago. You'll love it. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Take care.